Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of the three-part series, Writing and Righting the Wrongs in Archival Description. We're thrilled to have all of you with us today. My name is Kathy Krogelvarda. I'm the Director of Conservation Connection, which is a program of the Connecticut State Library. Conservation Connection is the program arm for the Connecticut State Historic Records Advisory Group. We are thrilled to have you all and to launch this program today. Just a little housekeeping. Please be sure to save your questions for the end. We will take all questions at the end of the workshop webinar. You're welcome to put questions in the chat. We ask that you start your question with a question mark so we can more easily find them and direct them to our speakers. Today's webinar is Approaches to Reparative Archival Description in Yale Special Collections at Yale University Library. And they're the library's Reparative Archival Description Working Group members are here today to share their insight in the work that they've been doing for several years now. I want to give you a brief introduction to our speakers. We have Michelle Peralta, who is an archivist supervisor for the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where she primarily supports the arrangement and description of archival collections. She holds a Master of Library and Information Science from San Jose State University, as well as a Master of Arts in History and a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities from San Diego State University. Prior to her role at Yale, Michelle worked in public libraries with community archives. Monica Lehman is an archivist at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. She is part of the Reparative Archival Description Working Group since 2021 and co-chair since 2023. She's also a member of the Best Practices for Archival Team Positions Working Group and an associate editor for the Journal of Contemporary Archival Studies. Before her current position at Yale, Monica was a project archivist, also at the Beinecke, and an assistant librarian at San Jose State University. She holds an MLIS from San Jose State University, an MA in English Literature from San Francisco State University, and a BA in English Literature from the University of California, Irvine. And Jennifer Coggins is the Community Engagement Archivist for the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. In this role, she helps community members preserve personal, family, and organizational records, promotes engagement with archival collections and practices, and supports local history work. She is also co-chair of the Yale Library's Reparative Archival Description Working Group. She previously served as the archivist for collection development and manuscripts and archives at Yale, and as collections management and engagement archivist in the University Archives at UNC Chapel Hill. She holds an MS in Library Science from UNC Chapel Hill and a BA in History from Wilford College. As we mentioned, this program is brought to us by the Connecticut State Historical Records Advisory Group. So I'd like to introduce Lizette Pelletier, the chair of the Connecticut SHRAB, who will tell us a little bit about them. Lizette is also Connecticut State Archivist. Go ahead, Lizette.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Kathy. So the Connecticut State Historical Records Advisory Board has been around since 1976. These were formed by the National Historic Publications and Records Commission during the U.S. Bicentennial celebration as part of a national effort to save and make accessible those documents that document the rights of people in a democracy, and as well as being necessary to study and appreciate American history. That was one of the requirements of the authorizing legislation to create these grants to go to states for records preservation and different programs having to related to this effort. The boards, when they were set up, were supposed to be diverse at that time based on the type of institution. So small historical societies to large historical societies, government archives, university archives, and other type of cultural heritage institutions that had records. Our board is authorized up to 19 members. We don't have quite that many at the moment, but we are really focusing now on diversity in the way that we're talking about it today, so that different groups and communities are represented on the board. Originally, the board's work was to be reviewing and approving the grants that were submitted to the NHPRC, but we've moved even beyond that in making recommendations in areas that look at documentation of records, or areas that are documented by records, I should say, as well as topics of interest in promoting. And we've also recently adopted a diversity statement on by the board earlier this year, that we're committed to expanding preservation, access, and discovery of Connecticut's historic record, and that we will be a diverse group of archivists, researchers, records managers, and records creators. So that is the work we do. And I hope you enjoy and learn something out of this program. I'd also like to remind individuals, I'm sure Kathy's been sending out these announcements, but we will be also sponsoring a program for those of you in Connecticut at the Greenwich Historical Society on October 30th. It's an in-person program from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on to help historical organizations, cultural heritage organizations working together for documenting the American 250 story, not just necessarily American Revolution. So I hope you pay attention to that. Registrations are closed on this Wednesday. And so I hope anyone in the area can sign up and come. It'll be a very good program. So I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Lizette and Kathy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Peralta, and as Kathy gave that very warm welcome to us, I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jennifer Coggins and Monica Lehman. We all work as archival practitioners for the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, and we are all current or former members of the Reparative Archival Description Working Group. And today we'll be talking about approaches to reparative archival description in our collections. And just a little disclaimer to start, our perspective is that of archival practitioners in an academic setting. We are not experts in reparative description in all contexts, but we are sharing how we approach reparative description in our context. And while our presentation is based on our experience at a well-resourced private university, we will also be speaking broadly about approaches to doing this work that we hope will be applicable to other contexts. Next slide, please. And so just an overview for today. We'll be starting with some definitions before talking about the work of the Reparative Archival Description Group and how it plans and scopes its projects before going over some example projects. We will also talk about some proactive measures and leave you all with a resource list. And during our presentation, as Kathy mentioned, we hope to touch upon a lot of questions and topics that you provided when you registered for this webinar, but we will also leave lots of time for questions at the end of our presentation. And so please feel free to use the chat function at any point during our presentation for questions, but please know that we'll be answering them at the end. Next slide, please. And so to start, we would just like to have present some questions to consider during our time today and to keep in mind when starting or thinking about starting a reparative description project. So what description exists in our collections, your collections? Who does it suggest the collection is for or about? And in my role, how do I shape that description? These are reflective questions that we take on as part of our guiding principles that Jennifer will talk about shortly, that highlight sort of cultural humility and slow archiving. And for now, I'll just pass things off to Monica.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'll just go over the definition. Reparative archival description is the remediation of practices or data that exclude, silence, harm, or mischaracterize marginalized people in the data created or used by archivists to identify or characterize archival resources. We took our name from Yale Hughes Watkins' article, Moving Towards a Reparative Archive, a Roadmap for a Holistic Approach to Describing Homogeneous Histories in Academic Repositories and Creating Inclusive Spaces for Marginalized Voices, published in 2018. So a little bit about us. We are a group made up of volunteers from across multiple repositories at Yale Library. We've been working on remediation projects as a group since 2019, and anyone in special collections can volunteer to be on RAD. In RAD's pilot project, which ran from November 2019 to May 2021, we remediated Yale Library finding aids and catalog records on Japanese American incarceration during World War II. The group developed recommendations in collaboration with Densho, an organization that documents the history of Japanese American incarceration during the war, and with the Japanese American Citizens Leagues. We implemented those recommendations, and we've shared this work through our LibGuide. Through this collaboration, RAD members were able to put community-preferred terms in the finding aids. So since then, RAD has been charged with drafting recommendations for remediating or contextualizing potentially outdated or harmful language used in archival description, and to creating archival description that is accurate, inclusive, and community-centered. We take on projects to remediate harmful language, we provide services within the Yale Library and beyond, and we host events promoting conversation around the topic of reparative archival description. So when you think of a reparative archival description, what does that entail? So this might look like changing a term, like when we changed the term internment to incarceration during our pilot project to describe the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. This also could look like a note added to add context to explain that a term, while outdated and harmful, could not be changed due to being creator supplied or being part of a published title. We'll talk about this more in detail when we talk about one of our projects. So we can change folder titles that were created by staff and add notes explaining why our process was and what we did. We may also change wording in a biographical note if it's too laudatory or euphemistic. For example, if a person was an enslaver, and there's a lot of like older language attached to that person's description. And you'll hear more about that later in this presentation when we talk more about our ongoing Yale and Slavery project. So now I'll hand it over to Jennifer, who'll talk more about our guiding principles.
Thank you. So when RAD formed as a working group, the group compiled a set of guiding principles to establish the values that would inform our approach to this work. And we frequently look to these guiding principles when we're considering how best to handle an issue that's come up or how best to approach a new project. And we want to make sure that our approach is always in line with our principles. So I'll just briefly go through these principles. Michelle just shared a link to where they're listed and described on our LibGuide as well. the first is cultural humility. And at the core of this principle for us is normalizing not knowing, recognizing that our understanding and our knowledge is limited based on our own experiences. And particularly when we're describing materials that were created by or related to a culture that we ourselves don't belong to, we should proceed with humility and assume that we don't have the full picture. And this brings us to the next principle that I've listed here, collaboration and consultation. We try with our projects as much as we can to work in partnership with individuals and organizations with relevant experience and expertise that can inform the work that we're doing, and to do so in mutually respectful partnership. Examples are, as Monica mentioned, in the pilot project that RAD did on Japanese American incarceration during World War II. We worked with community organizations that were able to consult and provide information and context for that project. And we often also, work with other subject area experts at Yale and beyond, archivists at other institutions that have described similar collections. And we also share our own work as much as we can so that can be a resource to others, and we can all, learn from each other and, support each other in that way. Another one of the guiding principles that the group chose is dismantling white supremacy. And this principle and this language comes from the resource Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. And that resource outlines characteristics of white supremacy culture, meaning, values and practices that are dismissive of marginalized people, their expertise and their perspectives. And the characteristic that we come back to often from that work is that of a continued sense of urgency. We see the work that we're doing in RAD as important, but we prioritize doing it thoughtfully and collaboratively in partnership with other people over doing it immediately, or doing it, the fastest and most efficient way, which may not be the most collaborative way. And that leads us to the principle of slow archives, which is a methodology proposed by Kimberly Kristen and Jane Anderson. And, in a lot of our archival work, we are encouraged to take the most efficient route, to do the most in the shortest amount of time. And that can make it hard to prioritize collaboration or to, do things in a thoughtful way that allows us to change course when needed. If we are, starting in one way and then realize that's not really the best option, we need that flexibility to be able to take our time with it and do things well and thoughtfully and intentionally. And we see our work as iterative as well. We often kind of work in phases on our projects, and we don't see our work as fixing something forever. We are very much part of a long, line of archival practitioners who have described and will describe these materials in the future, will have stewarded them in the past and will continue to steward them going forward. And we're doing our best based on the information that we have today to make collections more accessible, more welcoming, and more discoverable for the users who are using those materials today. And so we don't see it as, we've made changes to the description and now that's done and it will never change again. But we are sort of playing a role in the evolving description and understanding of the collection. Finally, transparency is a big part of our work. Our goal is not to simply erase previous archival description or to erase the fact that collections may have been described in offensive or harmful ways, but to provide proper contextualization for the decisions that have been made about the description of the collections, and when necessary, make revisions to that description. Being transparent about the work too helps emphasize to users that collection description is written by humans and it's open to change. I think often when people see a finding aid, there is this sort of institutional voice behind it, and it feels like something that's kind of written in stone and official. But making that work more transparent, making it clear that this description is based on choices made by people with their own biases and individual perspectives, and that it's open to change. We describe the revision work that we've done in notes in finding aids so that people are aware of changes that have been made. And we keep previous versions of the description so that those can be made accessible to researchers so they can see the history of the description of the collection as well. The scope of reparative description work, particularly at a very large library with many collections, could really be potentially endless. So a big question is where to start. How do we choose what issues to address, and in what order should we take them on? And in some places, I know that there have been more formal collection audits, or collection description audits, to identify issues and then to prioritize them. Our approach has been a little bit more ad hoc, not particularly methodical in that way. We haven't undertaken an audit of all of our collection description, in part because there's so much of it. That would be a very long project in and of itself. So, the way we look at it, any reparative work that we're able to do is worthwhile and is chipping away at all that needs to be done. We tend to take on projects based on what is immediately feasible for us and what opportunities and resources we have available. For example, when many of us began working from home during the height of the pandemic and were not able to process physical collections here at the library, we took on a project that didn't require access to collections, and it involved a lot of online research. For the pilot project on Japanese American incarceration, the group was already familiar with the guidance that had been shared by community organizations like Densho and the Japanese American Citizens League, and knew that there was some general consensus about the language used to describe these events and this experience. And so there was a good opportunity there to collaborate with organizations that were already engaged in this work and resources to draw on to do so. Many of our projects are also prompted by feedback from library users, including library staff. We facilitate feedback in a number of ways, including a suggest a correction form that is also used for things like typos and things like that people may come across in the description. But we make it very clear in that form that it can also be used to report issues with inaccurate or harmful or outdated language. And when we receive a request for a correction related to harmful language, we usually assess whether that issue may appear in other finding aids or in other collection description, just kind of get a sense of the scope of the issue, whether it's something that appears in one finding aid or 10 or 100. We want to get a sense of what the scale is and whether that's something that we can take on as a larger project or something we want to focus on the initial issue that the user raised, and then maybe think about other ways to scale that up as needed. And though our working group takes the lead on drafting recommendations and taking on projects related to reparative description, this work is increasingly embedded in day-to-day description work here at the library. We provide support to our colleagues through monthly Zoom office hours, kind of serving as a space to discuss reparative description issues, questions that people are working through, helping connect people with resources that may inform their description. And we know at other institutions, like at Princeton, processing archivists are allowed a certain percentage of their time to work on reparative description as opposed to description of incoming new collections. And that's something that we think is a great idea and really helps to make time for this work that can often feel like it has to be on the back burner because there's a backlog to work through, or new collections coming in, and that tends to get priority. So having this built into the work that archivists are doing, processing new collections and also revisiting legacy description, has been really helpful in making this part of sort of our basic operations at the library. And next, we will move on to sharing some examples of projects that we've worked on over the last several years. I think Monica is up next.
Thanks, Jennifer. So in November 2021, the United States Secretary of the Interior, Deborah Haaland, formally declared squaw to be a derogatory term and charged a task force to determine replacement names for geographical place names using that word. The Department of the Interior noted that the term has been historically used as an offensive ethnic, racial, and sexist slur, particularly for Indigenous women. That's a quote. In response to the Department of the Interior, RAD began phase 1 of what became a 2-phase project, which we located and remediated or contextualize the term in Yale's archival description. RAD has therefore likewise decided to use SQ in the place of the slur in its communication, so I'll be referring to it from now on as SQ. In phase 1, we either changed the place name or added contextualized notes to the finding aid for those place names. Most of the geographical place names had new names, so it was just a matter of going through, finding that description. Our metadata specialists ran some scripts, found that description, handed it over to us. It was more about like replacing that name with the new geographical name and adding contextualizing notes so people knew that those names had a new name. Then we were ready for phase 2. During this time, we found other instances of SQ that weren't geographical place names. They referred to people, or they were used in description for photographs and things like that. So we were encouraged by our leadership in the archival description unit to take on those other instances. So we found that we had about 28 instances to look at. So we decided this might be a great time to utilize volunteers from across the library. We had 7 people volunteer. We had a kickoff meeting in person so everyone could meet each other and we could go over the workflow. We divided up the collection so each person could look at about 7 instances of the slur closely to see if it needed to be remediated or a contextualizing note needed to be added. So we wrote those contextualizing notes together. I'll show you an example in a minute. And we found that most instances were creator supplied, so they would need a contextualizing note. We couldn't just change it. We set up a Teams channel so we could reach each other easily if we had questions. And we wrapped up together after about 6 weeks of everyone working on their assigned collections, in which we had a halfway point. And this was a very successful outcome. It was our first time doing it. And it was a great opportunity for people across the library, not only to get to know each other, but to volunteer and learn about how to do this work together. So here's an example of the contextualizing note. So actually, like, as you know, isn't always just one note. So we have one up at the collection level, and we usually add one at the folder level too. So at this note, this would be if we were contextualizing it, like if it was creator supplies or part of a published title, we would say things like this finding aid was revised, it had this language. This language has been retained, even though that Yale doesn't agree with these offensive terms. And we also have like the transparency that Jennifer talked about. We have previous versions if you're interested in as well. So here's a title that is in a publication. We couldn't take the slur out, but we did add a contextualizing note to kind of talk about the history and the impact of the term and explain why you will still see it in the description. So now Jennifer is going to talk about a current project that we're working on in conjunction with the publication of a book about Yale and slavery.
In February of this year, the book Yale and Slavery, A History came out, and it was one of the products of the Yale and Slavery Research Project, which was tasked with examining Yale's historical connections with slavery and with abolition. And the research for that book drew on a number of Yale collections, including the papers of 18th and 19th century university leaders and their families, as well as official university records from the university archives. The research team had looked really closely at a lot of these collections, and they surfaced materials in those collections related to slavery, related to abolition, and related to the experiences of enslaved people. And those were materials that in many cases were not already highlighted in the finding aids. They may have been found by users before and used in people's research previously, but were not called out in the finding aids. And many of these collections also, based on the description, they were, described in such a way that you would not necessarily know that these were collections that would be relevant to your research if you were looking for materials related to the experiences of enslaved people, or looking for materials related to slavery and abolition more broadly. So we saw this as an opportunity to enhance these finding aids, given that this research had just been done, that the book had been published, and also a lead researcher for the project, Hope McGrath, works with us here in the Yale Library now. And so, it seemed like a great opportunity to really use the research that had been done for this project and for this book to enhance the description of these collections. And we're talking about here about 20 collections that were identified as good candidates for this. We worked with Hope to revise description of these collections. And this is an ongoing project, so you won't see the changes just yet, but you should in a few weeks. We're working on it, getting those changes implemented. But we've drafted the revised description, and the revisions have primarily been the addition of information related to slavery and abolition in the historical and biographical notes for some of the collections, adding folder level notes, drawing attention to materials related to slavery, abolition, and the experiences of enslaved people. And whenever possible, adding the names of enslaved people to collection description when known. So if there is a document in the collection that names enslaved people, making that part of the collection description as well. We are also, for these collections, adding subject headings to indicate that these collections contain materials related to slavery and/or abolition movements, to try to make these more discoverable for researchers who would like to be using them in this context. And I'll hand it over to Michelle to talk about another project.
So the last project we'll be talking about today is the work that RAD did on women's names. So the scope of the project was to provide full name information for women referred to by their husband's names or their surnames in our agent records. So that means, a woman might be referred to as Mrs. John Smith, or Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, or Miss Smith, for example. This project began during the COVID-19 pandemic, which allowed staff the time to research and the ability to do this work remotely. The goal was to create records identifying women's first names, but also, where possible, information about their occupation, their nationality, and the dates of their lives, as a way to give a fuller view of their identities. So we started this work by querying our collections. We did this through the help of our metadata specialist colleagues, who ran a script for us to give us a list of records where women were referred to by their husbands or family names. And once we had that list, we began researching using Ancestry.com, Find a Grave, New York Times obituaries, remembering that we were all working in various remote contexts, and so all of our resources were largely online. But we also had our own finding aids to reference that contained biographical notes and information that were utilized to find information for these women. And we use spreadsheets to help us organize our work. After drafting the updated record, we vetted these changes with various stakeholders before making our final updates. And lastly, we added contextualizing notes to indicate whether or not changes were made to our record, and if so, what those changes were. Next slide, please. At the conclusion of the project, 207 agent records were updated or created. And this is a snippet of that list showing the previous names, which are on the right column, and their updated names on the left column. And in this project, we were able to find full name information for all but 9 women. Next slide, please. And then zooming into a record and how it displays in our discovery system, you can see sort of their biography notes. You can see their dates for existence. You can also see the general context note that we added. At the very bottom on the left is also that suggest a button or suggest a correction button that Jennifer had mentioned. And then on the right, you can also see the variants of their name. And more information about this project that goes into detail is on our LibGuide, which we've linked previously, but we will also put in our resource list for you all as well. And oh, just one, go back one, please. Thank you. And for this project and even the project that Monica talked about, the SQ project, these are examples of projects that we feel are really accessible. It doesn't, you don't have to run a script to find, to generate a list of records. You could also just query your own collections, use spreadsheets to keep all of the information sorted, and whatever the outdated term is or language that you want to change, the context in which it occurs, and then also ultimately what changes you do want to update. And for this particular project, the general context note, we just went in manually and updated each record, so it doesn't have to be complicated. And we hope that these projects can illustrate that we've tried to be really specific and intentional about our work. And the most important part is sort of just breaking things down into steps so that all projects don't seem overwhelming or but very doable. And so Monica will talk about some proactive measures that RAD is currently undertaking.
Thanks, Michelle. So as you've probably heard over the webinar, that most of our work is reactive. We hear from patrons and staff about the changes that we need to make, which is fine. It's great. It gives us a lot of information, a lot of things to work with, but you might be wondering if we do anything that's proactive. So one thing that we've done is we are currently working on some gender identity guidelines in consultation with curators and accessioning staff. We have written guidelines on gathering information about gender identities from the donor, or if they are the creator, how they self-identify their gender identities. So this information at the point of bringing in the collection can help us know the person's pronouns, so we know exactly how to write the description for them. And we also wanted to have an overarching statement for users of our collections. So as we've said before, we are aware that we have description that needs to be remediated and that we haven't gotten to yet. And we want our users to be aware of that. So we've made an overarching statement that kind of lets users know, which is linked here, that we do have collection materials from different sources and times, and we want users to be aware of that before encountering them directly in the collections. We wish we could remediate every instance of harmful description, but we know that this statement will help users know the things that they're about to encounter. So that's one thing that could be helpful if you're feeling overwhelmed already about remediating some description into collections is having a statement that will let your users know where you're at exactly and the knowledge that you have of your collections and the things that they might encounter. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to talk about the resource list.
So as promised, we put together a resource list for you all. There's a QR code here. There's also going to be, there's a link in the bit.ly link here, but also we will put this up on the Google Classroom as well for you. And please note that the resource list is not comprehensive. There are so many more resources out there. But we just wanted to give you a short list to get you started. And we also want to mention that one of the most helpful resources for us is collaborating with colleagues and other cultural heritage and sort of community partners. And so we encourage you to think about who else you can collaborate with within your institution or neighboring institution, and creating communities of practice. And so that sort of wraps up our presentation. We are happy to take general questions, and also our contact information is on this slide. And thank you all for being here today. Monica and Jennifer, do we want to go through some of, while people are thinking of questions, to go through some of the moderated questions first?
Okay, we do have a couple questions coming in, if you want to start with that, but I do want to thank Monica, Michelle, and Jennifer. That was a terrific way to start off this webinar series. It is so informative to see the work that you all are doing at Yale. It's really inspiring to see the different areas you've been targeting and how precisely you're rolling out this work. We have had a couple of questions pop up, so let me share this with you. One question we have, I am the acting executive director for the Temple Beth Israel Preservation Society. Oops, the question just popped. Let me go back to it. Let me jump back to in 1 minute. So let me go to another one. Someone mentioned vetting changes with stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
I can talk a little bit about that. So it looks different in every partnership that we participate in. Generally, when we are taking on a project, we try to think about who has subject area expertise, has experience that would inform the description of the materials, thinking about who are potential users of the collections and the way that we want to frame it for these users. And so we look to subject area experts here on campus, among our colleagues, as well as in the community, organizations or individuals that we know have expertise or experience that's relevant to those collections and can provide important context and insight into how they should be described. That may, depending on the availability of the people that we're working with and the level of involvement that they're interested in having, that can look like, having meetings to discuss the description, sort of brainstorming together and talking about the issues related to it that we want to address. In some cases, we have kind of done a first draft and shared that with people who are knowledgeable and have relevant experience and have gotten feedback from them on that. So it can look, in different in different cases, but we try to, enter into these mutually beneficial and respectful partnerships with organizations or individuals to do this work in a way that's very thoughtful and collaborative. And I should also note that when we are working with people who are consulting from outside of the university, we offer compensation for that, for the work that they're doing.
Wonderful. Michelle or Monica, anything to add to that? Okay. The question that kind of just bounced off my screen and I just brought it back. Let me repeat. I am the acting executive director of the Temple Beth Israel Preservation Society. As a Jewish organization managing a community archive, we are deeply aware of the rising anti-Semitism, especially following Hamas's attack on October 7th, 2023 and the ensuing war. How can we approach archival descriptions, reparative or otherwise, that acknowledge both the historical context of Jewish narratives and the current climate of hostility while ensuring sensitivity and accuracy to our community's experiences?
I don't know if others have other thoughts, but I think that's a really interesting question. My first thought is that it seems like it's a great opportunity being in a community archive setting to engage with the community that you are part of and serving in your institution. That having a collaborative approach to talking with people and soliciting input on how collections are described and what description it seems most appropriate for people represented in your collections as well as users of your collections. It seems like you may be in a good position to make that a really engaging and participatory process. And I don't know if others have things to add to that.
Okay. Nothing else from our speakers, so let me move on to the next question. One person put up something really great and practical. They said, I love to hear more about the monthly office hours. Do folks just bring in examples they've encountered? Do you have themes, or is it entirely open topically?
I could talk a little bit about the office hours. So we send out every month, we remind people we have our office hours. We don't change the date. It's always the third Thursday in the afternoon every month. And we have a form that people can fill out before if they want to, or most of the time people just show up. They are not very well attended. Most of the time we get at least one or maybe two people. We also sometimes we leave it very open. We ask people, if you're new to Yale and you'd like to know more, this is a great jumping off point. You can come in and ask questions. We have done some topics. We've talked about projects that we've done whenever we're looking for new RAD members. We open it up and have old RAD members kind of talk about their experiences and projects, and people could ask about, what's the timing like and how much of a commitment is it? And so we can go over those questions more. I feel like when we do have those focused topics, if we're talking about a particular project, our attendance goes up as well. And we're also available. We do get emails too, so people can say, I can't make it to the office hours, but I have this question. Can we set up an appointment, talk things over with? So we found it's been pretty successful.
Terrific. Thank you. We have two questions that are very similar. So I will read them both, but hopefully we can answer them at once. When working with communities, were there conflicting opinions on preferred terms, and how were they handled or resolved? And similarly, how are you coordinating new terms recommended by community members with national thesauri or authorities? Okay, one of the three of you has to take this.
I can start a little bit. I think one thing I would say is that we have often, chosen projects to work on where there is, as in the case of the Japanese American incarceration pilot project, where there is some community consensus about the language to be used. I think in other cases, where there is more sort of disagreement within the community that is being described or that created the materials or is reflected in the materials about the way that those materials are described. That's an opportunity for us to maybe acknowledge that and perhaps include, more than one term, or, to provide the context that, we've made a choice about how, these are described, but acknowledging that that is not something that everyone agrees on. So I think providing that information to the user so that there is transparency about the work that we're doing and the choices that are being made, and acknowledgement that there's an awareness that there isn't full consensus about that terminology is contested and will continue to be contested into the future. The other question about the authorities' work, that has generally been a little bit outside of the scope of our group. We're being at a large library, there is a lot of people have areas of specialty, and we stay in our lane, but we are in frequent communication with the units and other working groups that do that work, so that they're aware of things that we're working on. We can coordinate efforts with them. So we may not be doing that work directly, but we are making sure that the people who are doing that work are aware of the things that we're doing, and we can coordinate efforts as possible.
Perfect, thank you. Another question: how do you address problematic language of the past? I'm currently grappling with meeting the needs of modern researchers without sanitizing the past.
I think one thing we've done to address that is to add those contextualizing notes to acknowledge that this is the language that was used, and we acknowledge that it is harmful, and acknowledging that these are the notes these are terms like we talked about with published titles and creator supplied titles that we cannot change. And I think just making sure that folks know that, and can see the contextualization of like where this came from in history and at one point the description was written, I think can be helpful.
Wonderful. Another question: are you only working on addressing one problematic term at a time, or are you working on multiple renaming projects at the same time?
We try to keep it really scoped. We have about 8 members, and we want to make sure that everyone is working on something at the same time. But we have in the past had to we have a very large spreadsheet that we call our parking lot, that we put things aside when we don't have the capacity or the time. Like Jennifer mentioned, we don't want to take anything on that we have to rush through, or we don't have the time to consult with people about. We always want to make sure that we're able to be in touch with those communities. So we would never let's just do this project really quickly without talking to anyone, just get it done. So we do juggle a lot of projects at the same time. I think currently we have about 3 or 4 renaming projects at the same time. And we're always on alert for things that are coming through. And these can take many forms. Sometimes, like we've said, we've gotten a patron request, and then we find that we have more description that needs, that patron pointed out, that needs remediation, and it turns into a larger project. Most of RAD's projects, they kind of look like an iceberg. They look very small at the top, and then once you get digging deeper, we find that there's so much beneath the surface. And like we said, that all of our RAD members are volunteers who do this work on top of their regular day-to-day job, so we're very conscious of that. So there have been periods of time where we're like, let's hold off on phase 2 and wait a little bit while we get some documentation in a row. And our leadership has been very supportive of that. Jennifer, do you want to add anything?
Oh, I would just say that in terms of how we organize the work, we have several RAD members, and we sort of divide up into subgroups to work on different projects. So there will be one member who is the lead for a particular project, and usually 2 or 3 other members that are part of that. So we may have multiple projects going on at the same time, but we're not all working on each one.
Wonderful. That seems to be the end of our questions in the chat. I want to thank everybody for participating and sharing. These are some really terrific questions, and thank our speakers for the terrific um, responses. I think we've all learned even more through all of that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have done a recording of this session. We will be sharing that, the resources that Monica, Michelle, and Jennifer shared. I think they're also going to be sharing their slides. All of that will go out both through email and through the Google Classroom, because I know there's been some issues with some people getting into Google Classroom. So everyone will get access to all of this information. You also will be getting an evaluation. Conservation Connection and SHRAB, we both like real-time evaluations so we can edit and make changes before next week's webinar if we need to. So please make sure to complete that evaluation when you receive it. Part 2 of this webinar series, Writing and Righting the Wrongs in Archival Description, it's next Monday, October 28th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We're not usually familiar with having to add Eastern Time to our programs, but this program has really gone viral. We're delighted to have people from all over the country and even all over the world who will be participating with us. So I hope you do use the Google Classroom to chat with our presenters and with others who are participating and attending these sessions. It's a great way to see what people are working on and share your questions as well as your expertise. There is a link in the chat to the program on October 30th in Greenwich for anyone in Connecticut and New York who wants to join us. That's going to be a really terrific program with members of not only SHRAB, but also the Connecticut America 250 group, and learning so much about the work that's already starting to be done about using archives to find untold stories, both from the time of the Revolution and later on Connecticut and American history that was influenced by the ideals of the Revolution. So I want to thank everyone. A big thanks to Monica, Michelle, and Jennifer for a fabulous kickoff to this webinar series. We're really grateful for your participation and have all learned so much from the work that Yale has been leading here, not only in Connecticut, but throughout the archival world. So thank you all for being here today. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Okay. Hope everyone has a great day and a terrific week, and we will see you next Monday.